Stand by for broadcast.
You're listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations.
Hello, I'm Squadron Leader Peter Lisney, and in this episode we compare the Atlas with the Hercules.
Of the 2,500 people that were evacuated from Sudan, around about 2,000 of them were on A400, and that was a mission that was supported by A400 and C-130. If you were to draw a square around the wingtips and the nose and the tail on both aircraft, there isn't actually a great deal of difference between the two. There were a lot of things that C-130J only picked up as it went through its service life in terms of capability, and the same is true of A400.
Also, in this episode, we'll reheat a few stories just in case you missed them, and we'll be finding out who is under the hat this week.
What bit of luxury kit do you never deploy without?
My beard brush, because I like to have a silky, smooth beard.
Find out who is under the hat at the end of this episode. Now, when the Atlas C.1 A400M entered service with the Royal Air Force 10 years ago, many asked whether this tactical airlift aircraft would ever be as good as the much-loved C-130 Hercules. Who better then to pass judgement than a pilot who has flown both aircraft for almost equal lengths of time? I met with Flight Lieutenant Seb Davey to find the answer. Flight Lieutenant Seb Davey from 24 Squadron, A400M, Atlas pilot. Welcome to Inside Air.
Thank you very much.
This is perhaps a long overdue episode of Inside Air as we dive into the cargo hold of the A400M and talk about A400 or Atlas. You know, I've noticed when we had a chat before, you're calling it the A400, but, you know, officially it's Atlas.
Well, that's absolutely true. So, obviously A400M is the Airbus designation of the aircraft, whereas Atlas C.1 is the Royal Air Force designation of the aircraft itself.
Okay, so we're going to flip-flop between the two because we're still confused, aren't we? Okay. And we're also going to talk about the C-130 Hercules.
Yes, absolutely. So I spent 12 years flying the Hercules between 2002 and 2014. So that forms quite a large part of my career as well. Okay,
yeah. So let's just give a very quick potted history of Seb in the Air Force. In fact, Seb in uniform, because it started before you joined up properly, didn't it?
Yes.
And then we're going to ask you a really important question, which is better. But let's talk about Seb.
Okay, so I joined Southampton University Air Squadron in 1995 whilst I was studying aerospace systems engineering at Southampton University. Spent 3 years learning to fly whilst at university, whilst doing a very busy degree course, so a bit of juggling going on then. Joined the regular Air Force in February 99. Went initially down the fast jet stream, didn't get terribly far down there before they decided that my skills were better suited to another stream and went multi-engine. So that following that went to Cranwell for multi-engine pilot training on the jet stream. And then was posted as the first ab initio to the C-130J, so the newer of the Hercules models, which first came into service in 1999.
So that's a glass cockpit C-130?
That is the glass cockpit C-130J, yes, absolutely. So updated avionics, updated engines that were more powerful, and probably the biggest difference in terms of crew was it was a 3-crew aircraft, captain, co-pilot and loadmaster, versus the extra engineer, air engineer and navigator that were on the C-130K.
Okay, so You said you flew until 2012, the C-130, was that what you said?
It was 12 years, so 2002 until 2014.
2014, okay.
Yes.
Did they have to drag you away kicking and screaming and say, no, Seb, you're on the Atlas now?
No, do you know what? Actually, I requested the move, not because I didn't enjoy flying the C-130, but it was just for a different challenge, really. And also, it was beginning to be a bit obvious that the writing was on the wall for the C-130, and it was having been involved very early days on the C-130J and enjoyed it so much. I've really quite fancied the chance to do that again, but with the C-130J successor, so the A400.
Okay. Now, I suspect that just about everyone listening to this podcast has seen you fly, but not an Atlas and not a Hercules. What have they maybe seen you fly?
I also have what I term as a weekend job as well, which is flying for the Battle of Britain Memorial Flight, and I'm a Lancaster and Dakota display captain and also a qualified flying instructor on both those aircraft as well.
Wow. Are there many pilots that do that job?
So currently we have 3 multi-engine pilots flying the Lanc and the DAC. 2 of them are A400 pilots, and one other is a ex-C-130J pilot who's now teaching multi-engine pilot flying at Cranwell on the Fenham.
Okay. So we're here to talk about Atlas and a little bit about Herc, but we're going to get distracted right now. What is it like to fly the Lancaster?
Well, I get asked that question a lot, as I'm sure you can imagine. I would term it, comparatively to the A400 and even to a certain extent the C-130, as real flying. The controls are not power assisted. It's a completely different configuration for the undercarriage. It's 2 main wheels at the front and a tail wheel at the rear on both the Lanc and the Dakota. So they have their own challenges in terms of takeoff and landing. They're very sensitive to crosswinds. In terms of the actual flying, the mechanics of it are not really any different, except that the margins that we have are much smaller. So, for example, the G limit on the Lancaster is only 2G, and when you're doing some fairly tight manoeuvres at an air display, it is quite a challenge to stay within those. We manage it, but that's only through very careful handling of these 80-year-old aeroplanes.
Super. Look, we'd love to come back next year and have a visit to BBMF and have a walk around the Lanc and talk to the pilots and crew and ground crew.
Sure, I think that's probably something that we would be able to arrange.
Cool. Right. Now.
50, 40, 30, 20, 10, 5.
Did you play top trumps as a kid?
Yes, I did. I wasn't very good at it, but
you still play it in the crew room, probably.
Well, not so much anymore, but definitely yes. Top trumps is a game that I'm familiar with.
Okay, so I think perhaps it's the best way to have a look at a C-130 versus A400 Atlas.
Sure.
So, which one's better? Big question. Right, range.
Well, so Atlas has got a much greater range than the C-130, and it's not just in terms of absolute range when empty, because clearly the role of the aircraft is to take stuff to places. So with a load of 20 tons of freight, for example, Atlas can go around about 4,000 miles. Slightly less than that, I would have said, probably 3,700 miles, which a C-130 can't get close to.
And when it comes to humanitarian aid and disaster relief missions that I'm sure you've flown plenty of in your career, that's a game changer, isn't it?
Well, yes, it can be. So when you couple it with the short field performance of an A400M, now C-130 was known for being able to land on short strips. It's one of its ace cards. But the fact is that the A400, but due to its more powerful engines and more powerful brakes, can land on the same sort of short strips as the C-130J did, but with a lot more freight on board. And not only that, because the A400 has 14 wheels, i.e. 14 contact patches, that weight is spread over a larger surface area than it is in the Hercules.
I've never thought about that.
Yeah, so in the Herc it was 6 tyres, so 6 contact patches, for an aircraft with a maximum mass of around about 70 tonnes. With A400 it's 14 contact patches with a mass of around about 140 tonnes. Now we're talking maximum masses there, but 140 divided by 14 is clearly a larger number than 70 tonnes divided by 6.
Yeah, I just got this picture of people listening to this, hopefully not while they're driving, Googling photos of the C-130 and the Atlas and having a look. I've got a book in front of me and I've just opened up and I'm like, oh, yeah, significant. Okay, I'm going to put you to the test here. What is the length of the A400? Nose to tail.
Nose to tail. So what's interesting about both aircraft is that if you were to draw a square around the wingtips and the nose and the tail on both aircraft, there isn't actually a great deal of difference between the two. It's because of the performance of the wing on the A400, which is very clever, that actually, in terms of ground area that's taken up by both aircraft, there's not a huge amount of difference.
Okay.
But I mean the A400 is a little bit longer than the C-130.
Okay. Well, to put you out of your misery, I've got some stats here. Length 42.2 metres for the Atlas, and 34.34 for the Mark IV Herc. Yeah, sure. And the wingspan is sort of 42.4 as well. So it's almost a square shape. Yeah, and wingspan for the Hercules, 40.38, so very close, aren't they? Yeah. So that's what I mean. So in terms of the ground area that they take off, in terms of parking space that they need, there's not a great deal of difference between the two of them. Okay, all right. So size, fairly equal. Within the bounds of what you are allowed to say, maximum altitude? 37,000 feet for the A400, which is pretty impressive for a four-engine prop aircraft. For C-130, it's around about... I mean, it had a service ceiling well into the 30,000s of feet, but for various reasons, it never really went up there. And the max altitude that we tended to fly at in C-130 was sort of around 28,000, 30,000 feet, whereas with A400, it's very, very often up around the 35, 36, 37,000 feet, and clearly up there's efficiency benefits in terms of fuel burn. Okay. And also in terms of being able to use some of the stronger winds, such as the jet stream, in order to travel the distance faster. Okay, so that's going to extend your range as well, isn't it? Well, absolutely, and also to evade any weather. So in terms of thunderstorms that we absolutely don't want to fly in, there's a lot less weather as you go up in the atmosphere. Okay, now you alluded earlier to the takeoff distance, landing distance. Can you tell us what those distances are? There's not a great deal of difference between the length of airfield needed for either aircraft. And the other huge difference in terms of risk management is that there are 3 standards used for landing performance within the military. One is normal operating standard, one is reduced operating standard, and the third is military operating standard. And as you go through each of those, we reduce the safety factor to do with landing distance and takeoff distance. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're reducing the safety of the takeoff or landing. It's reducing the spare amount of runway that we have. We normally allow,
in the region of 1.5 times the runway that we need. As those performance standards reduce, then we're reducing it. I mean, the distance that an aircraft takes to land in is the same. It's just how much spare we allow either side of that. The C-130 had to land military operating standard on natural surfaces, whereas with A400 we've decoupled that, so we can have the same safety factors going onto a dirt strip as if we were going to land at Heathrow Airport, for example, or Brize Norton.
Let's look at this from confidence from the pilot's perspective, because you've spent almost similar sort of time on both aircraft. Is there a difference in confidence when you look back at your whole career and now flying the Atlas, where you feel more comfortable with the Atlas than you did the C-130?
So I've been to some not particularly friendly places in the C-130, and there is definitely a feeling amongst C-130 operators that the aircraft is one that looks after you. Okay, we place quite a lot of faith in the C-130. People love that aircraft. I love that aircraft as well, and it was very capable of what it did. It was very versatile. It was well protected in terms of defensive aid suite. That same sort of protection is on the A400 as well. The big difference in terms of confidence, I guess, is the situational awareness that we get from the A400. So the C-130 was pretty good in terms of avionics suite. At the time that we started flying it, it was pretty much the most modern aircraft in the Air Force inventory. I remember that we quite often would we'd have passengers from tornado detachments who would come up to the front of this, as they perceived it, smelly trash hauler and look at our flight deck and say, hang on a minute, these are better avionics than we have to a large degree in the tornado. How's this happening? But shortly after starting to fly the A400, I went back to the C-130J Sim, and it was surprising how dated it felt compared to the A400. There's a load more avionics in the A400, load more, which translates to load more situational awareness available for the guys at the front flying them. I mean, as a comparison, there are 4 TV-style screens in the C-130J, 2 for each pilot, which meant that you would have one for each pilot with the radar, let's say, displayed on it, one for the engine instruments displayed, and then another. The fourth one could be used to display a moving map, or some other display that you'd want to have up there. In the A400, there are 8 screens to do the same job. 2 of those are used for the flight management system. 2 are used for the aircraft systems in terms of the warning messages that come up, and the engine instruments or the pressurization of the aircraft, etc. But then each pilot then has 2 screens to use for what they want to. So potentially a radar, potentially a terrain elevation systems, or called TORS, terrain alert warnings, avoidance warning system, and each pilot can have a digital moving map in front of them as well, with multiple different scales on it. So it's just that ability for both pilots to have sort of multifunction displays displaying various different types of information directly to them without necessarily having to choose too much which information you can have displayed at one time.
I'm going to ask you a random question here. I've no idea what the answer is going to be, but did you ever drive the old Land Rover Defender, and have you ever driven the new Land Rover Defender?
So I did drive on occasion, very rare occasion, the old one, but I haven't driven a new one. Okay. So This I could sort of guess where your question is going, but actually,
Well, yeah, take it.
But actually, I'd use that as an answer to when people ask me, "What's the difference?" or "Do you ever get confused when you're between flying the A400 and the Dakota or Lancaster?" The way I tend to describe it is driving a car with and without power steering. So Defender to new, old Defender to new Defender. I think that's a quite a useful comparison in that respect. With respect to A400 to C-130, C-130 was not fly-by-wire. It was traditional hydraulically assisted controls. If you put in an input that would potentially damage the aircraft would not stop you from putting that input in. Whereas A400, with its fly-by-wire nature, there is no physical connection between the side stick, as it is in the A400, and the control surface that you're moving by moving that stick. It goes through a computer first, which essentially you're making a demand. The computer says, yes, I can give you that demand without damaging this aircraft, and therefore I'm going to give it to you. If you request something that's going to damage the aircraft in terms of G or even speed, then the aircraft, because this it's various inputs from the stick and from the thrust levers, the computer will essentially override your poor decision, shall we say.
Okay, all right, that's very well handled. So let's have a chat about some of the maybe misconceptions that can be put to bed today. And they might have been truth going back a few years, but maybe less true today. And one of the things where there's been criticism has been serviceability. How are we doing with that?
Okay, so the serviceability does rear its head quite a lot when people talk about A400 and C-130. There are things that we probably need to be clear about. So just as when the C-130J was new into service, it did have teething problems. There were serviceability issues with that aircraft as well, and throughout its life as well. And that was with an aircraft that wasn't particularly at the leading edge of technology. What we're talking about with A400 is an aircraft fitted with some of the most powerful turboprops ever produced. Okay. At over 11,000 shaft horsepower, they're twice as powerful as the ones that were fitted to C-130. And I think it's probably an expectation with an aircraft we're just talking about the engines here. When you take into account the fly-by-wire system, which, by the way, is very, very reliable. I've never seen a particular problem with that. And the level of technology that there is on board the A400, we have had some teething problems with that aircraft. Now, most of them have now been ironed out. To the extent that when the A400 was in support of pitting, and when it was in support of the non-combatant evacuation operations from Sudan, the aircraft fulfilled every single mission that it was planned for. Okay, so we didn't lose any missions or any flights through unserviceability. And
those missions really mattered. I mean, that was life or death mission, wasn't it?
For those that we were evacuating, yes, absolutely. So it was important that the aircraft performed during those missions, and it did. And not only that, it was doing exactly what it was designed for, taking relatively large loads, albeit people, out of not necessarily in the case of Kabul, but certainly in the case of Sudan. It was shorter airfields with quite large transits either side, but it was able to do that and still take a lot of people. Of the 2,500 people that were evacuated from Sudan, around about 2,000 of them were on A400, and that was a mission that was supported by A400 and C-130.
So how many more trips would the C-130 would have had to make it to carry the same, roughly, to carry the same amount of people?
Well, it's not quite. It's not just a case of size of aircraft. It's not just a case of how many people you can put on the aircraft. It's to do with the length of the airstrip that's being used versus the takeoff performance and landing performance of an aircraft with load on it. So, and also, as we've talked about already, the fuel to get to where it's going. So, it's in terms of performance, the A400 could take more people because it was able to take off in the same distance at a heavier weight or heavier payload
because the tolerances.
Yeah. Well, it's not just the tolerances; it's the sheer performance of the aircraft.
Yeah,
and also very, very hot place, and heat and altitude are both factors that reduce the performance of a turboprop and jet aircraft.
That's pretty significant, because the more times you have to fly into a hostile environment, the greater the risk is. Every time you fly in, there's a risk. If you can reduce the number of times you fly in because you've got a greater payload, then that's positive.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's hard to disagree with.
Okay, with capability. Now, I think because C-130 was so mature, it had great capability and in breadth of missions that it could fulfill. Whereas Atlas, when it came online, was somewhat limited, and it has been growing over the last 10 years. Can you tell us about, put to bed some of these misconceptions that still kick around that no longer actually are true?
So there are a couple of factors involved in that. One is that A400 was released in a state of modification that wasn't full operational capability. The reason being that some air forces required the aircraft sooner than others in terms of the capabilities that it was replacing, and therefore A400 arrived not with the full capability of equipment to do all of these more esoteric tasks that are associated with a tactical airlifter. The bonus was that, in the old days, if you wanted to improve a capability of an aircraft, generally you had to change some of the hardware on it. You had to fit extra equipment, which wasn't necessarily always possible, or if it was possible, wouldn't integrate very well with the rest of the flight deck. The big difference with A400 is that a lot of it is software based. So all the hardware is there, it's just that the functionality from the software needed further development. And that's why we're seeing capabilities come online all the time with A400, and A400 is quite regularly going back to Airbus facilities to have different software loads put onto it, which increases the capabilities. It means that the aircraft can do different types of airdrop or different types of mission because the software has had extra functionality put into it. And to a large extent, it's a bit like comparing, let's say, Windows 8 to Windows 11. The base operating system, within reason, is fairly similar. It's just the different capabilities from the different upgrades that happen to the software that make it more capable. So that's one of the factors. Another factor is that we don't just put our aircraft or give our aircraft across to either the instructional squadron, which is 24 Squadron, or the frontline squadrons of 30 and 70. We don't just hand this new capability and say, get on with it, work out how you're going to use it. it has to go through a test and evaluation process first. And 206 Squadron are tasked with that on the multi-engine side of things. And clearly, Defence has, with a new aircraft, there are several different capabilities that need to be evaluated. And one, make sure they're safe. Two, come up with the best method for employing them. And with a new aircraft, there's a huge list of these capabilities that Defence would like, and there clearly has to be a priority order because 206 are not a huge unit, and any aircraft that they use to test and evaluate these new capabilities is off the line for operational and training purposes whilst it's being done. So, we don't want to give all of our aircraft to 206 for them to evaluate a capability, because it means that it can't be used in the capabilities that are already cleared. So if you were to compare, for example, C-130J to C-130K and that transition, that happened a lot back then as well. There were a lot of things that C-130J only picked up as it went through its service life in terms of capability, and the same is true of A400. It just so happens that because of the service life of the C-130 versus A400 upgrades, etc., that there, in some cases and for some capabilities, there has been a bit of a gap between the handover.
Okay, I think what some of the listeners will be thinking about is airborne delivery, parachute, high altitude.
So it's funny. So high altitude parachuting has been done for several years now on A400. Low level parachuting only really started happening this year. Boat drops have been happening for about a year now. Aerial delivery itself started happening in 2017. So it's just as different capabilities come on board, that's when they get first tested and evaluated, and then released to the operating squadrons.
Yeah, and of course C-130 only recently retired anyhow, didn't it? So there was that dual.
For a great deal of time, there was there were quite a few capabilities that C-130 could do to fill the gap until A400 was able to do them.
Okay. Is there anything I've missed on that front, capability that people that ask you about?
I mean, the key capabilities are sort of long-range insertion. So the fact that we can do air-to-air refueling as a receiver. Last year there was it was called Exercise Joint Guardian. Mobility Guardian. Exercise Mobility Guardian, which there was a single A400 flight from Bryce Norton to Guam in one trip, which was just over 20 hours long. It's about an 8,000 mile distance with 3 refueling brackets, and the idea being a demonstration of the capability to use A400 to travel a long distance, but then at the end of it potentially use its capability to land on a dirt strip. Yep. So it's a long distance insertion to somewhere that may be austere. It's all part of the agile combat employment of the aircraft and of our defence forces. Okay.
Well, that's a huge achievement, isn't it? To halfway around the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you're doing that sort of length of insertion, you end up reaching the limit of the cruise endurance, as in the air cruise endurance, before you hit the aircraft's endurance, because you're extending it constantly with air-to-air refueling. So for that particular trip or that particular sortie, there were 3 full air crews on board.
Let's talk a bit about the ground crew, because it's a slightly different arrangement than C-130 had, isn't it, with the ground crew?
Yeah, so C-130, although there was civilian company involvement in C-130 depth maintenance, first line servicing was pretty much exclusively military. Voyager, although there's military involvement, is very heavily civilian engineering based as a private finance initiative. Now A400 lies somewhere in between those two. The aircraft are owned by the Ministry of Defence, and it is very much a civilian military endeavour in terms of first line engineering. So we have military engineers working alongside civilian and Airbus engineers at Bryce Norton, generating the aircraft for day-to-day use.
Now, when you deploy overseas, you take your own engineers with you, don't you? Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So, although there are some of the civilian engineers who are able to deploy, will generally deploy with military engineers. Specifically, we have a group of engineers, all senior NCOs, who are probably the best way to describe them is super techs, in that they are qualified in all four of the traditional specialisations within aircraft system engineering. That being airframes, propulsion, electrics, and avionics. So they will lead the first line maintenance of the aircraft while it's away. They'll normally have one or two assistants with them, but the aircraft can be run for a pretty long time without having to go to second line maintenance. So it's certainly not a problem for an aircraft to go away with these GEs for a month plus.
GE, is that general engineer?
It's ground engineer.
Ground engineer.
Their official term is AGE, which is aircraft ground engineer.
That sounds like an amazing job to have if you're in the engineering world.
Yes, I mean, clearly, we had them on the C-130 as well, and they're some of the most capable engineers that I have ever had the pleasure of meeting. Certainly in terms of sort of hands-on engineering, and we used to say they're worth their weight in gold because they could keep an aircraft running when as safely as well, because and it was clearly within their interests to make sure that it was safe because they were flying on said aircraft, but they were incredibly capable, and certainly what I would call a force multiplier, or at least a high return asset, in that for one person they could keep quite an important asset going for quite a long time, or repair it should it be needed. So spares could come out to an aircraft if it had broken, and it was not safe or sensible to fly it, and they'd be able to repair the aircraft fairly quickly to allow us to get going again. But yes, they're very, very I mean, the flip side for them is that they would get to travel quite some quite exciting places around the world, and it was evident that they enjoyed doing that as well. So yes, to answer your question, I think it's a pretty good job. Okay,
and as far as multi-engine aircrew, why should they aspire to be A400M Atlas pilots?
I mean, you're asking someone who's very biased.
Well, that's fine. There you go. It's your chance. Get on the soapbox. Do it.
I think what's attractive about A400 is the range of flying activity that we do. So it's the variety within the job that is probably the most exciting part about it. One day you could be flying a long distance around the world somewhere, A to B, with a freight load to support defence interests somewhere around the globe. The next task could be low flying training with airdrop in the UK. The next day you could be landing on a dirt strip at night using night vision systems. Then you could be dropping parachutists for a ceremonial event potentially, for example D-Day 80 this year. The next day you could be doing maritime reconnaissance and search and rescue, and also there's some of the much more rewarding parts of flying a tactical air transport aircraft in terms of medical evacuation, humanitarian relief. Those throughout my career, those are the things that I have found most rewarding, is being able to help someone by using the skill that you're trained for.
Yeah, it's all very much echoing the C-130 life.
Well, this is it. I don't tend to view it. I mean, often the discussion goes to which was better, the C-130 or the A400, and actually they both do the job really well.
Yeah.
So I can't really get on board with a whole this versus that argument. It is, we can still do the things that we want to do with the tactical air transport aircraft that we have.
What's around the corner for A400M Atlas? What's coming next? Any new capabilities to look forward to that you can share?
I mean, one of them is formation flying should be coming shortly.
Okay.
And that's formation flying at low level. So the bonus of that is being able to deliver 2 aircraft or 3 aircraft loads rather than just one at a time in a very sort of concentrated time period. So that can be beneficial for airborne delivery of personnel. It can be beneficial for airborne delivery of stores. So you can get, 24. It's just a maximum load of 24 tons. Drop wise, you might be able to drop 48 tons now by using a 2-ship.
Let's talk about the training program for aircrew. Can you just give us a comparison between the pathway for a military aviator who will end up on A400M Atlas versus an aviator going through civilian airline training?
So the first thing to take into account is that RAF flying training is quite selective. There are multiple aptitude tests and quite a stringent interview process, medical aptitude that takes place for the military pilot selection. On top of that, flying training in the military has been pared down to the minimum necessary, and on the front line, on my squadron, on 24 Squadron, we have pilots coming to us that maybe have done around about 100 hours of flying training, which is significantly less than is done before those going towards commercial aviation, certainly towards the end state of commercial aviation. That is mitigated by the fact that we do quite a lot of training in our simulator for the A400. The simulators are of a sufficient standard that the flight model is absolutely spot on for the aircraft. If you can fly the simulator for an A400, you will be able to fly the aircraft without any problem. The flight decks are identical, the flight model is identical, to the extent that some of the capabilities that I've been talking about have been developed in the simulator and then taken to the aircraft, and the aircraft has behaved in exactly the same way. So that's the level of fidelity that we're talking about with our simulators. And the training course for A400 delivered by 24 Squadron is of the order of 80 hours in the simulator. Now, it would be possible for us to take our trainees, train them for 80 hours in the simulator, and prod them out to an aircraft and say, right, don't break it, we'll see you later. We don't actually do that. We do send flying instructors with them for their first few sorties, and indeed for their first few overseas sorties, just to make sure that they carry out the task to the standard that's required. But the simulator provides us with a method of training people at lower cost than the aircraft, and obviously the simulator is always available at Bryce for training. They run Monday to Friday, sometimes up to 20 hours a day, with instructor crews training trainee crews, and that can be for all the disciplines. So it can be for what we call the basic mission qualified crews, which involves the A to B flying, the maritime reconnaissance, the search and rescue, the operation into tactical environments. Then we go through advanced mission qualification, which is low flying, airdrop by day and by night, and the natural surface operation, landing on dirt strips, through to the full mission qualified crews, which is delivering high altitude parachutists. And that can all be done in the simulator, which is a real bonus.
Okay. Is it coming out on Microsoft Flight Sim, do you know?
I'm not sure. I had heard rumours that it was going to be in MSFS 24, but I haven't seen it, so I'm not sure whether it is or not.
Maybe people can sort of brush up on their skills before they go through military flying training system. Come to you already ready.
Well, you never know.
Just to wrap it up, I want to take you back to the Top Trumps game.
Okay.
And less conventional on Top Trumps, but let's imagine that there's one of the rows of the table says likes or hearts. Which one wins on the hearts, the likes?
I think that most C-130 operators have a huge affinity for that aircraft. The point being that aircraft has been in service since the 50s, in various forms. There's quite a close affinity and camaraderie between Hercules crews. It's been a very familiar sight within the militaries worldwide for decades. So there is a certain amount of, I wouldn't say rose-tinted spectacles, because it's still a very capable aircraft and used by air forces around the world, but definitely there is a love for the C-130, and I think that anyone who's ever flown a C-130 won't ever lose that. That said, the A400 is a very similar ethos. I mean, a lot of the not exclusively, but a lot of the A400 crews that have transferred from other aircraft have transferred from the C-130. So there is still that ethos and that camaraderie there with the A400. It's a tough question, and I think that there are a lot of C-130 people flying A400s who would say C-130 every day. There are a lot of people who never flew the C-130 who would have to say A400 every day. And there's probably the odd person who flew C-130 who would say A400. So there's love for both aircraft types. I know it doesn't really give you the answer that you may have been looking for, but there's definitely a feeling of endearment towards both of them.
Yeah, I'm sure if you've picked up this podcast via the RAF Facebook page or the YouTube, you'll scroll down the comments and you'll just hear an outpouring of love for the C-130. But that is going to be generational, because C-130, that's for me, because I remember 30 odd years ago flying out to the Gulf in a C-130. It was either freezing cold or boiling hot, depending where you sat. It's so uncomfortable as it was, and the gents wasn't actually brilliant. But flying home, it was like flying home on Concorde, because it was coming back from ops, and that was, but that's generational, because what's happening, today, the newest people that join the Air Force or the Army, Royal Navy, they won't be flying in C-130 anymore with the Royal Air Force, and they're going to build up this affinity and love for A400M Atlas. I'm sure of it.
Well, I hope so. I mean, in terms of the flying home part of it. If nothing else, you'll get home faster on an A400.
There you go. Sold. Super. Well, Flight Lieutenant Seb Davey, thank you so much for sharing your experience and love for both aircraft. I really appreciate it.
And no problem at all, you're welcome.
Hi, I'm AS1 Emma Kerwin, and this is Reheat, where we take a look back at some of the RAF stories you might have missed. The UK and Qatar are deepening their defence collaboration, focusing on joint Typhoon and Hawk aircraft squadrons. They've signed new agreements during a state visit by the Emir of Qatar. It includes expanded collaboration within 12 Squadron, the joint UK-Qatar unit, based at RAF Coningsby in Lincolnshire. To RAF Marham now, where new accommodation is being built for junior ranks. A ceremony has been held to mark the start of work on the second of 4 new single living accommodation blocks for personnel. A memorial's been unveiled to commemorate the crew of a Halifax bomber who lost their lives when their plane crashed during World War II. The aircraft, which was not on an operational mission at the time, suffered engine problems over Northallerton. 4 Canadian and 3 British airmen were killed. Military working dogs from across the RAF have gathered at Honington for a 5-day masterclass in tracking and detection. It was hosted by canine experts at the Training Capability Units in Suffolk. Santa has swapped his sleigh for an RAF helicopter to deliver presents to Oxfordshire's Children's Hospital. Father Christmas was flown in on a Puma chopper from RAF Benson to the base's primary school to pick up the presents. And a bit of sport for you. The British Army will host the RAF in the first round of the 2025 Challenge Cup competition. The match will be held in Aldershot on the weekend of the 11th and 12th of January in a rematch of the RAF's 24-12 title-clinching inter-services match in Wakefield. That was Reheat for InsideAIR.
I'm AS1 Ben Russell, and this is Under the Hat, where we get to know an aviator in less than a minute. Name you're known by.
I'm Corporal Dan Edwards.
What's your profession?
So I am based in RAF Brighton. My profession is SC Tech.
What's the best thing about your job?
Visiting various locations all over the world.
Hardest part of your job?
Being away from the children.
Best location you've served?
America, because it's just one big playground.
What bit of luxury kit do you never deploy without?
My beard brush, because I like to have a silky, smooth beard.
And what's your proudest moment in the RAF?
I think when I joined up attestation day.
Thank you, Corporal Edwards, for being the latest aviator to take part in Under the Hat.
That's all for this episode of Inside Air. Please give us a review and subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and join us again soon.
You've been listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations. If you're serving in the RAF and have a story for us, please speak to your unit media and communications officer. Inside Air is written and produced for the Royal Air Force by RAF Media Reserves.